Okay, so we're going to continue to build off of this initial tiling of our surface with hexagons. We're going to alter some of these things, show you a couple other options and iterations that you can do to, again, apply some type of different and unique texture. Again, we're just building off of this kind of smooth surface that we've created from a height field. But now we've started to apply a slightly different cell style with these hexagons. I'm going to adjust them a little bit so they aren't kind of just these equal sizes, but rather make them a little more kind of narrow. So I'm going to drag this so now they're kind of long in some areas. You can see that again, it's going to alter kind of the quality of some of these landforms, but still we have quite a bit of diverse conditions in our landform. And again, we're using the same parameters of just basing all these transformations on the slope conditions of our surface. We've still got the one that's scaling these based off of those slope conditions. We have the original, and then we also have this part that doesn't actually have any geometry, but it is giving us the ability to move objects based off of the angle of those cells. So again, if I look at it this way, this is kind of just visualizing that movement and that direction of movement. So that's what this component is doing for us, is that it's not necessarily giving us a, oops, I don't know why that baked, but let's just delete that. This is giving us that direction, and then we can start to even control how much it moves in either direction. And you'll start to see that again, and some of these other, once we start to apply some actual geometric transformation. So the last one we showed how you can take this scale hexagon and move it in those directions using this. So let's do some other things though. So maybe we just want to simply extrude these hexagons based off of that direction. So let's give that a shot. So I can go to Surface, Freeform, Extrude. Really doesn't matter between these two because we're using a direction. If you actually have a curve itself, you can use that for the other ones. So here is our component. It's asking for a base curve, so that's this original one. Then it's asking for the direction. So this is now where we can apply this to start to give us some direction, right? And it's just going to give us pretty much an extrusion of those edges. It's not going to make a physical object quite yet. And this actually might create some issues. So instead of actually extruding, I can still move these components, or these cells. So let's just actually use the move. And they're all going to be based off of, again, these values. So it's pretty much still an extrusion without the actual walls themselves. And again, I can start to adjust how much they extrude based off of these values, right? So there's where it hasn't moved, and this kind of gives you an idea of how that starts to move in those respective directions. So let's just stick with one for now. You might want to adjust this. So again, areas that are really flat, don't move as much versus ones that are sloped move more. So we can control that as well. So again, if it's 0, I actually don't want to have a move, so you can keep that one there. So I've altered this to actually inverse this, so it's usually set to 0, 1, but I've inverted that, so now it's 1, 0 in order to get that response. So let's kind of move some of these out a little bit more. So again, there's a little bit more movement based off of those slope conditions. It's a little hard to see with them just wireframed like that, so I can now go to Freeform and do a ruled surface between the initial one, the original one, and these new ones. So it's essentially doing the same thing as the extrusion, but it's allowing me to still have this curve that I've moved outside because I want to give it a solid top or cap it. So with that, instead of doing a planar, because these again are in all sorts of weird kind of geometries, it's going to be difficult, but I can use the fragmented patch to create an actual solid surface from that, right? So now I can see that it's actually kind of fills in all those holes. And again, we aren't changing the size or scale of these. We're literally just taking that same size, that original size, and just moving it up to different elevations. So you can get kind of crazy with this, where you can really start to move them in different heights. And again, don't worry too much about what it looks like as a preview. It's got low preview settings, but once I actually bake this, I just need to bake the one where it's got the walls, right? And then this capped surface. So let's just select those. Let's make sure we're on a good layer. So let's go to panels, layers. And yeah, we can just stick with the default for now because I'm just using this to show you the results. All right, so now I can turn all this off. Now we got a better idea. And it's pretty interesting, to say the least. Again, areas that are flat are not have as much changing, but the areas that gets sloped have much larger extrusions. So it's a little hard to see just kind of the legibility of it. It's still kind of interesting, but it has its own kind of advantages and disadvantages. So that's one way we can do it. Another way is that I can, again, kind of, let's get rid of these things that I just did. Turn on preview again. So maybe I just want kind of these soft, smooth extrusions. I showed these kind of scaled, solid forms in the last video. I just showed you just simply extruding those. Maybe we just want these slight kind of rounded surfaces that come out of this. So again, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to use my amplitude. I'm going to, instead of moving this geometry, I'm going to move the point. So similar to the extrude to point, right? But we're going to do something that creates a softer extrusion. So we're going to use the patch. And again, it's asking for curves and points. So we want to actually make sure that we've got the curves themselves and their center points, which are, again, found from here. So I go to parameters, points, just so I can, again, kind of show you what I'm talking about. So these points are also going to be part of this component. And these are the ones I want to move using my amplitude. So I can do move, plug the point into there, again, within their respective distances. I probably don't need it to be nearly as much. And you, again, we'll see the results based on that. So you can kind of see that these ones don't have a lot of movement. So maybe you want to, again, kind of have as little movement as possible. So you can see by adjusting it that way, we can have various different outcomes. Okay. So again, maybe we want to have a little more, because usually if I just see green and not a lot of red, that means there's not a lot of movement. I want there to still be some decent movement in those other areas. So let's just keep dragging that. That looks like it'll give us slightly better results. Because again, the points, it's not going to actually reach that with the surface. So it's going to need some adjustment. You'll see that once I actually plug this stuff in. So in order for this patch to work appropriately for this example, we want to separate our curves. So treat each one of these curves separately instead of, again, just a giant pool, as well as the points, because then it's just going to create one giant surface. But we want essentially the points and the cells to create their own unique surface and do it for each one of these cells. So in order to do that, I need to graft it to, again, separate the data into its own separate branches. And what I'm going to do first is plug in the points, because it's hard to create a surface with just points, and this just helps with the kind of processing of this. And now I can plug in my curves and wait a minute for it to generate this. The other thing that I probably should have done too with this patch is change the spans of the surface. So it's set to a default of 20 by 20 cells to make each one of these surfaces. So imagine each one of these hexagons has a surface made up of 20 by 20 little smaller grid points. And so it's going to take some time to actually create that, and it actually messes up my display here. So it'd be good to actually reduce that. I mean, you'll see when let's turn it off and bake it. And it'll even take a while to bake because, again, it's a lot of information. But it does kind of create an interesting rendition of these areas, kind of slowly kind of extruding in different directions. It kind of create, instead of a very sharp extrusion, these more soft extrusions. And it's cool when there's a lot of just really kind of flat areas and then you just have these subtle little mounds coming out. Let's see, so you can see just how detailed these actually are. So let's actually just try real quick. Let's go ahead and delete that. Let's change our spans to something like 5. And I'm also going to, let's lock this so that I'm going to make a couple of changes, but I don't want them to all happen at once. I want to be able to make them and then allow it to reprocess this. So let's try this. So I'm going to enable it or unlock it. So this should look a little more subtle. It also helps with my display setting. So I don't see a lot, again, because of the graphic display, but once I bake it, let's take a look. Again, this isn't showing they're rendered, it's still just showing it, but you can see that they're a lot less dense of surface grid. So let's now look at it rendered. Right, so again, we've got kind of these softer areas, and then the more kind of mounded areas in those parts. Sometimes good, again, like display is kind of looking weird, so if you want to see it, you can always try a rendered preview. Let's try a better angle of it. And I'm also going to change some settings in here so that the ambient light's a little bit darker, so I can see a little bit more of it. Okay. Now let's try rendering, because again, like, it looks like it's really choppy, but I'm pretty sure that's just the display settings. Could be completely wrong, but let's just take a look. Looks a little better when it gets rendered, but let's try one more way to see it. Let's actually just turn the sun on. If I turn the skylight off, it kind of helps too. But it's, again, one of those things you're going to have to just kind of mess with your height slider to give it the appropriate kind of extrusions. So let's look at it one more time. Maybe you'll see the shadows for these a little bit better. That's okay. But again, it's just another way to look at how this gets retextured. So that'll be it for this one. Hopefully this is getting you familiar with all sorts of different ways to create 3D surfaces. There's obviously a couple other options the more you kind of get comfortable with this idea. The next set of videos will show how, again, you can maybe change from having hexagons to another type of panel, and then look at some other ways to extrude the surface.